I think like the good thing about coming after Chile is that there's a lot of similarities between Peru and Chile. So but I do not have to explain many things. If you think about Peru, what we had post 2010, 2011 as a very significant reduction of our growth rate compared to the very high level of the 2000s, of course, as a result in a good way of the booming commodity prices. At the same time, we had a widening current account deficits, which had a lot to do by the fact that growth was led by exports, right? Commodity exports, natural resources exports. Now, if we see that's one challenge, right? If we see our composition of exports over the last, I mean, we start here in 1987. It could be 1980, 1960, 1970. Things have not changed a lot, right? We keep exporting pretty much the same products that we exported, like a few decades ago. You could argue that within agriculture, things have changed, right? We have moved into precision agriculture, so it's a lot more sophisticated. The Peruvian coast is a lot greener now than it was before because we have managed to channel the water that was going to the Atlantic Ocean into irrigating with irrigation products irrigating the coast, and then we got a lot of new land for agriculture. Now, the truth is that Peru is a very, very conservative country, and Lima is particularly conservative. I was talking yesterday with a Harvard political scientist, Steve Levitsky, and he has coined this label, the Lima consensus, right? In which people think that what we do in Lima is pretty much what makes sense. And it's particular because our bad experience in terms of industrial policies in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we basically moved into very orthodox policies that had not changed much, I would say, over the last 25 years. But the truth is that we have a problem. We are growing a lot slower than before. We have an economy that hasn't transformed sufficiently, and we have large segments of our population that are in the informal sector still. So we launch with a real problem and with the political constraints, we launch what we call the National Plan for Productive Diversification. Before I joined in 2004. What we really had was an industrial plan, and I convinced the president to change it from industrial plan to a product diversification plan. If it were so easy to become Taiwan or Korea, everybody would do it, right? And we need to pay attention to our extremely strong comparative advantages, right, in a few resources. So we need to start from there. So we basically follow 6 main lines of action in our diversification plan. The first one is try to facilitate, right, new engines of growth. We need new sectors, new export sectors that compensate by the lower commodity prices and the lower inputs coming from commodity prices, right? Second, we need to, when Luis was talking, I mean, I thought he was going to mention this McKinsey Institute about the 2 Mexicos, kind of, because you had an average productivity that was not fully representing like 2 different sectors, and we have that multiplied by by many times in Peru, where you have like a very modern sector, very highly productive, and a very large sector that is very with very low productivity, so huge productivity gaps. So our second line of action was to increase the productivity of the MSMEs, whatever. MIPIMES in Spanish. The second one is, the third line of action was to improve financially those. Then we have other actions in terms of innovation, quality, and modern industrial parks. But I'm going to focus here what we have done in the first two lines of action. I think we have done something interesting, and I wanted to share with you. We have set up working groups to solve what we have been what we think are clear problems of coordination between the public and the private sector, right? What are they, right? It's a temporary public-private working group where people basically sit once a week, okay? And it could be related to a sector. It could be related to a factor. So we have right now, we're working with forestry, with aquaculture, with textiles, with gastronomy, with the gastronomical sector, agro exports, and in the factor level, we started working with the logistical table. Why do we need to have a working group? I guess the first, if you had a fully functioning, well-functioning state sector, you would not need a working group. But the truth is that we have huge amount of public coordination failures. The private sector, when they see and they see different entities of the public sector. Let's say if I have a forestry investor, I have to deal with at least 5 to 8 entities of the public sector that do not coordinate between themselves. Like international cooperation normally work like a matrix, right? There are regions, there are divisions, but the Peruvian public sector, and I think it shares a lot of similarities with a lot of public sectors, it works in sectors. So, but the problems are normally transversal, right? So if I am somebody leading, trying to invest in the gastronomical sector, I have to deal with 3 or 4 different ministers or entities that do not coordinate between themselves. So the first thing to make sure to pay attention here is that we need to take care of that. The second is that the public-private interaction is complicated because of history of corruption, history of lobbies, history of mistrust. A typical public sector employee does not trust the private sector because they think that they are lobbyists and people who only care about money and don't care about the country. The public sector, the private sector, at the same time, do not trust public sector employees because they think they are lazy bureaucrats who just create norms, regulation that don't allow them to work well and to thrive, right? So there's this mutual trust. The working groups allow people to sit together and empathize. And the private sector people realize that there are a lot of guys in the public sector that actually are willing and capable of solving their problems. And the public sector employees actually in the groups understand that a lot of private sector people really want the best for their countries, but also the best for the companies, but also the best for their countries. And the third reason why we need the working groups is because there's a limited bandwidth. We don't have thousands of public sector employees that can deal with all the problems that we have. The level of sophistication is not, in our public sector is not particularly high, and there's a lot of know-how being generated with the sectoral groups that actually have to be expanded. But right now, we have started with the real constraint of that public sector bandwidth, right? So it makes a lot of sense. It has made a lot of sense to really focus resources, trying to allocate our best people to sectors with high potential where we can generate, and we have generated. I think that's important. We launched this like a year and a half ago, generated a significant, rapid impact with very limited resources, right? So how does it work? Here, we use the word sectoral working group. We call them in Spanish mesas ejecutivas, and we have, as I said, the most part have been sectoral, but we have, we started with a transversal working. First, we do define the sector, right? We have involved the private sector from the very beginning. We have not decided what sectors we're going to follow. In every case, has been the sector that the private sector has proposed, okay? And we are asking them, what sectors do you think have potential in the country? And some are just obvious, right? Take forestry. Forestry, Peru exports approximately $150 million of forestry products. Chile exports 35 times that, right? If Chile does it, it's very likely that Peru is going to be able to make it cheaper because of cheaper energy, more sun, right? Cheaper labor. So, the Chilean forest exporting boom basically had a lot to do with a comparative advantage with the Pino radiata. The Bolaina in the Peruvian jungle grows in 8 years, fully. The Pino radiata, the Pino grows in Chile in 23, 24 years. We have already a very clear comparative. So how come it has been the case that Chile exports 40 times more than we do, 35 times more than we do? And it had a lot to do with the fact that we did not pay attention to that sector. I mean, it was just totally, and there were a lot of publics who we could support. I'm going to explain that just in a second, if I have time. The second thing is that you need to decide where a working group is viable. I think the most important thing is you have a private sector willing to participate. Here, we're talking about weekly meetings with owners or general managers of companies. We're not talking about business association bureaucrats. We're talking to the guys who really do the work, right? And they have to be willing to come, and they have to be organized, and they have to be with a social commitment. The truth is that what we found is that there are not that many, right? It's not that you have 25 groups that you can set up, right? So what we did is, for example, some people suggested a human capital working group. They were not sufficient, but there were not sufficient private sector guys who really care about the human capital because it was probably too much of a long term. However, some people suggested a logistical working group. That one had a lot of support because 80% of our experts go out of Callao, and there were a lot of logistical problems. So we need to convene them. After that, we convene the main participants, right? Then you need to generate the problems. And here, this is crucial. You need to understand what problems the private sector, the public sector can solve, and what problems the private sector can solve. So in other words, your problem, my problem. If you are inefficient because there's a regulation missing, right? If there's infrastructure missing, in general, there are public goods that are not being offered by me, right? Then it's my problem. But if you are inefficient because China or Vietnam or Cambodia in the textile sector made you inefficient, right, or not competitive, that's something I cannot do, right? If you cannot, so I am going to clean everything to make sure that you are as competitive as you can, but problems that you cannot solve, right? Of course, whenever you ask a private sector person, the most likely, what do you need to be better? They're going to say, look, if I have a lower income rate, right? If you have an exemption, if I have a subsidy, then you solve my problem. The truth is that we said that's off the table. We are going to focus, and that's of course Ricardo had a big role to play there in stimulating intellectually. This is we focus on productivity. We are going to do things for you only to increase productivity. We will not be doing things to increase profitability that don't increase the size of the pie, right? So take the aquaculture guys. What they were saying, I'm going to, what they were saying, we need a lower income tax. We had an income tax of 15%. Now you are, so during 10 years, aquaculture guys had a lower income tax, but aquaculture did not take off in Peru. What happened is that you did not have a sanitary authority to make sure they open new markets. So people, if you did not have new markets, right, you would not be able to export. So what we did is we told them, look, we are not going to reduce the income tax, but we are going to focus on the real problem, that you really do not have access to new markets, and we're going to provide that public good. So we created Sanipes, And now the Chinese market is being open, the Brazilian market is being open to our langostinos. So basically now they have the huge potential to basically export a lot more. So I think it has been very crucial to focus on the problem and the solution. What we have found is that there were no real diagnosis ex ante. So it's not that we could come up with there wasn't a blueprint for forestry, for aquaculture, for textiles of what to do. We had to generate a diagnosis. There were no studies that were useful. We had to generate between the public and the private sector with weekly meetings a right diagnosis. And this works something like that. Assignment responsibilities, deadlines, show rapid progress, right? So you have a problem, a request from private sector, the proposed solution, commitments, responsible deadlines. Really, this has worked fantastically well, really. Is that you have a matrix, all the guys from the working table have a matrix, and they know, like if you are committed to solve this problem 3 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, right? And you are able to learn a lot on the ground from the private sector participants, right? And the majority of the problems can be solved at a technical level. Whenever a problem requires a political commitment because it goes beyond a technical problem, then you elevate it. But that means that your bandwidth can be actually amplified because you are working with public sector employees, and the time from the minister is relatively limited in terms of the use, right? So I think that the one reason this works is because there is accountability, because you need to go back to the mesa 2 weeks from then, 3 weeks from now. When I joined the government and I realized something, right? Somebody would come from the private sector, from the business association. They would tell me about a problem, and okay, I took note, right? I was with somebody from the ministry there, and then I really don't know what happened 2 or 3, 4 weeks from now, right? So what happens is that you have a meeting, but because there's no accountability, 3 or 4 months from there, probably nothing happened. What the MESA does is really allows you to make sure that things happen, right? And you have meetings that have been taking place on a weekly basis that make sense and have been able to solve the problems from the private sector. Otherwise, how can you explain that the guys have been willing to come every week for a year and a half, right? And I'm going to skip this because these are some of the examples. But in terms of this is going to be my last slide, right? What I want to say, what's less important, right? It's less important to pick the very best industries, probably, right? It's probably more important to have an organized, capable private sector who is willing to work, and you need to have people with the right incentives, with the right commitments to work, right? Second, it doesn't make sense probably to make a big bang approach. We did not make a huge announcement with 25 sectors. We started with forestry, we moved to aquaculture, creative industries, gastronomy, textile, logistics, agro-exports, etc. Now, it's amazing because there's a lot of economies of scale. I think we can easily sustain 10 sectors. But we started with an agile, iterative approach that allows us to learn, to accumulate know-how, and based on know-how that we have been able to accumulate, now we can go into newer and other sectors, right? We did not need big budget. This is probably the most cost-effective policy that you can think of. You really need to coordinate. So for me, the cost has been the coffee, the orange juice, and the sandwiches in the meetings, and the time of the public sector officials. But in terms of money, this has cost very little. In times where fiscal resources are probably a lot more scarce, this is a very cost-effective way of working. Again, you do not need long studies, long groups. I was in October 2014. We were about to launch a big study, right, about the sectors. And I did not have time because our time is up. I'm leaving in July. right? I have, for all practical purposes, 18 months to work. Any study would have been ready, right, by the time I was gone. So I said, I'd rather start with what I have. Let's see the sectors where the private sector is demanding. Let's focus on them. They see where they are willing to commit. Sometimes they propose, the business association proposed a sector, and the guys did not show up to the meeting. That sector doesn't have a revealed preference, sort of, no? If they didn't show up, they don't care much. That sector was not picked, right? So we did not need that. We just need concrete solutions to build the problems, quick wins, and iterate. Right now, we are announcing already big investments in the forestry sector. The logistic group that MESA was set up 2 months ago has able to reduce the traffic around the port of El Callao significantly. We are really getting a lot of important quick wins with little resources. I think this is a way that has worked for us. Doesn't necessarily work for everyone, of course, but for us, with limited capabilities, we're able to expand into different sectors. I think Peru's growth path probably will imply jumping, of course, into different trees. These are the trees that we have around, and this is very low-hanging fruit. Okay, thanks very much.